She was 18 years old. She had never kissed a man, never left her county, and never done a single thing wrong in her life. And her father sold her for $40 and a mule. Not to a kind man, not to a safe home, to Rowan Creed, but the most feared name between the valley and the timberline. A man people crossed the street to avoid. A man whose first wife died in the mountains and whose children hadn't smiled in 3 years. Everyone said Eliza wouldn't last the winter. They had no idea what she was made of. If this story pulls you in, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one's going to take a while. The snow came early that year. By the second week of November, the settlement of Caldwell Crossing had already buried 2 men, one from exposure, one from a bar fight that went 3 rounds too long. And the winter hadn't even shown its real teeth yet. The kind of cold that settled over those mountains wasn't the clean postcard cold that people back east romanticized in their letters and their novels. It was mean cold. Bone-deep, spirit-breaking cold that crept through the gaps in your walls at 3 in the morning and made you question every decision that had led you to this particular patch of frozen nowhere. Eliza Hale had grown up in that cold. She knew it the way you know an abusive neighbor. You never got comfortable with it, but you learned its patterns. You learned when to duck. She was awake before sunrise that morning, the way she'd been awake before sunrise every morning since she was old enough to be useful. The small room she shared with her 2 younger sisters was barely bigger than a horse stall, and the single wool blanket they split between them had more holes than fabric at this point. Eliza had pressed herself against the wall through the night, ceding the warmest part of the mattress to her sisters without thinking about it. That was just what she did. That was just who she was. She dressed in the dark. Wool stockings. A patched dress that had once been green but had faded to something closer to the color of old dishwater. Her boots. The left one had a sole that was separating, and it made a faint slapping sound with every step she took, like a dog with a loose paw. She'd been meaning to fix it for 2 months. She hadn't had the money for thread. The kitchen was cold enough to see her breath when she came downstairs. She got the fire going with the focused, efficient movements of a girl who had done this 10,000 times. Checked the water barrel, half full. She'd need to haul more from the well before her father woke up, or she'd hear about it. Her father. Thomas Hale was a man who had once been something. That was what people said, anyway, when they were being charitable. He had such promise when he was young. He'd come west with a land deed and a young wife and plans that stretched further than the horizon. But the land had turned on him, the way land in this country sometimes did, and his wife had died having their 3rd child. And somewhere between those 2 losses, Thomas Hale had decided that the world owed him something, and that the card table was the most likely place to collect. Eliza didn't resent him. She had tried over the years to hold on to resentment as something useful, something that might push her somewhere, but it kept dissolving into something more like exhaustion. Resenting her father was like resenting the weather. It took energy she didn't have, and it didn't change a single thing about tomorrow's forecast. She had the porridge going when she heard his boots on the stairs. Thomas Hale was a tall man who had once been broad through the shoulders and had since grown soft in the belly and hollowed in the face. He moved through the kitchen without looking at her, went straight to the shelf where he kept a bottle, found it empty, and made a sound in his throat like a dog that's been kicked. "There's porridge," Eliza said. "I can see that." He sat down at the table. She set a bowl in front of him. He stared at it. Something was wrong. She could feel it the way you feel a shift in barometric pressure, not with any specific sense, just with the back of your neck. Some animal part of the brain that was older than language. "Papa," she said carefully. "Sit down, Eliza." She sat. He looked at her then, and what she saw in his face wasn't guilt exactly. It was something more complicated than that. Something that had already made peace with itself, the way a decision looks when it's been made in the dark hours and the making is finished and what's left is only the telling. "I need to talk to you about something," he said. She heard the whole of it in pieces, the way you hear bad news, parts of it landing clearly, parts of it just bouncing off the surface of your understanding and falling away. Rowan Creed. The name hit her first, before anything else. Even in Caldwell Crossing, where hard men were common as fence posts, Rowan Creed was a name people lowered their voices for. She'd heard stories about him since she was a girl, that he'd killed a grizzly with a hunting knife, that he'd broken a man's arm in the saloon with nothing more than one hand and no particular change in his expression, that he lived alone up in the high mountains with his dead wife's children and came down to the settlement only when he needed to trade furs, and that when he came, people found reasons to be somewhere else. She'd never seen him. She'd only seen the shape he left in the air around his reputation. Her father was talking. She made herself listen. The debt was $40. More, with interest, but $40 was what was left after Thomas had apparently surrendered everything else he had of value. The good rifle, the plow horse, the silver watch that had belonged to his own father. $40 and an old mule were what remained between Thomas Hale and a beating, or worse, from the men Creed did business with when he came to town. He said he needed someone to manage the house, her father said. He was looking at his porridge, someone who could cook and manage the children. He's got 3 of them, up there. Been without a woman in the house for 3 years. He bought me, Eliza said. Her voice came out flat. She hadn't intended flat. It was just the way it came out. It's more like an arrangement, Papa. She looked at him steadily. He bought me. Thomas Hale didn't answer that. There wasn't an answer that would have helped. When? She said. He leaves this afternoon. She breathed in, breathed out. She looked at the fire, the small orange heart of it behind the grate, the only warm thing in the room. Does he know how old I am? Eliza, does he know I'm 18? It's not that kind of Papa. She said it quietly. Just his name, like a door being shut. I was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, snow was beginning to fall again. Not dramatically, just the thin, persistent kind that settled in for the long haul. He knows, Thomas said finally. She nodded once, slowly. She stood up, took her bowl to the wash basin, and set it down without making a sound. I need to pack, she said. She didn't cry. She'd learned young that crying in this house was something you did alone or not at all, and she didn't have time for alone right now. She had a few hours, and she was going to use them. She packed carefully. The practical things first, her warmest underlayers, the good wool socks she'd knitted herself over 3 winters, her mother's sewing kit with its bone needles and its thimble worn thin on one side, a small bundle of dried herbs she'd collected and hung herself, a book of medicinal remedies that had belonged to her grandmother, the pages soft and foxed at the edges, the handwriting cramped and difficult in places. She knew most of it by heart anyway, but the book felt like something to hold on to. Her sisters came to the doorway and stood there watching her pack. Ada was 15, Molly was 12. They had their mother's eyes, soft brown, the kind that went shiny with emotion before the rest of the face caught up. Where are you going? Ada asked, though Eliza suspected she'd heard more of the kitchen conversation than their father knew. Up the mountain for a while, Eliza said. Ada was quiet for a moment. With Rowan Creed? Yes. Eliza! Ada's voice had dropped to something close to a whisper. People say he's... I know what people say. Eliza folded her extra dress and set it in the bag. People say a lot of things. Not all of them turn out to be true. She didn't entirely believe that, but she said it like she did because Ada was 15 and she was going to be the one managing this household now, and she needed something steadier than fear to stand on. She pulled Ada into a hug, held her long enough to feel her sister's breathing slow from the tight, high-chest kind to something closer to normal. You take care of Molly, she said quietly. Make sure Papa eats. Don't let him at the bottle before noon. Just redirect him. Don't fight him about it. It's not worth the fight. Ada nodded against her shoulder. And fix that latch on the cellar door before it gets much colder. I was going to do it, but... She stopped, pulled back, looked at Ada's face. You'll figure it out. She hugged Molly separately, and Molly, being 12, just cried outright and didn't pretend otherwise. Eliza held her and rocked her slightly and said nothing at all, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't be a lie, and Molly was old enough to hear the difference. She met Rowan Creed at the edge of town at 2 in the afternoon. She'd formed a picture of him in her mind. The standard frontier brood of stories, red-faced and loud. The kind of man who took up space aggressively. She was prepared for that. She had her face set for that. He wasn't that. I was enormous. That part was true. Not just tall, but built in a way that suggested the mountains had made him, the same way they made boulders, through sustained pressure over a very long time. He had a dark beard shot through with early gray, and his hands, when she saw them, were so scarred and weathered they looked like something carved rather than grown. He was standing beside 2 horses and a loaded pack mule, checking the straps on his gear with the precise, unhurried attention of someone who understood that the difference between a strap done right and a strap done wrong could be the difference between coming home and not. He looked up when she approached. His eyes were gray. Not a warm gray, not slate or silver. A flat, functional gray, like the underside of winter clouds. They moved over her once, taking inventory, and then he turned back to the horses. "You Hales girl?" he said. "I'm Eliza Hale," she said. A pause. "You bring what you need?" "Yes." He nodded toward the horses. "That one's yours for the ride up. She's steady. Don't fight her on the steep parts, just let her pick the footing." That was apparently the extent of the introduction. He handed her a buffalo robe, heavy, smelling of smoke and animal and cold, without looking at her, and then he swung up onto his own horse in one economical motion and waited. Eliza stood for a moment. She looked back at Caldwell Crossing, the low brown buildings, the smoke coming up from the chimneys, the settlement that had been the entire geography of her life for 18 years. A man she didn't know was watching from the door of the saloon. A woman across the street was pretending to look at something in the opposite direction. Nobody came to say goodbye. Her father had not come to see her off. She swung herself up onto the horse, settled the buffalo robe around her, pointed herself toward the mountain. "Ready," she said. Rowan Creed made no acknowledgement. He simply rode, and she followed, and within 20 minutes the settlement had disappeared behind them, and there was nothing in any direction but pine trees and snow and the sound of wind pushing through both. The ride took 4 hours. She'd expected conversation and gotten none. She'd expected some kind of declaration of terms, what she was expected to do, what her position in his household would be, whether she should understand herself as a wife in name only or something else entirely. She got none of that either. Rowan rode ahead and she rode behind, and the only sounds between them were the horses breathing and the creak of leather and the mountain doing what mountains do. It gave her time to think. She used it. She cataloged what she knew. 3 children, no mother, 3 years without a woman managing the household. A man who came to the settlement for trade and left quickly. A reputation that had accumulated enough weight to make his name itself a kind of warning. She cataloged what she needed to do. Survive. Figure out the layout of whatever she was heading into. Find the points of leverage and the points of danger. Keep herself intact. She thought about her mother, who had died when Eliza was 11. Her mother had been a practical woman. Not cold, but practical, the way that women in hard country often were, because practicality was what kept you breathing. Her mother used to say, "You can be frightened all you want, just don't let the fear drive." The fear was driving right now, if Eliza was honest. It sat in her chest like a stone she couldn't swallow and couldn't put down. But she kept her back straight and her face neutral, and she watched the mountain coming up around her, and she made herself memorize it. The shape of the ridges, the direction of the wind, the way the pines grew thinner as the elevation climbed. Because information was survival, and she intended to survive. The light was going purple and gray when the cabin came into view. It appeared between the trees suddenly, the way things appear in mountain country. Without warning, without ceremony, just suddenly there. It was larger than she'd expected, solid, built from timber that had gone dark with age and weather. A structure that had clearly been made by someone who understood that beauty was a luxury and function was the point. A stone chimney, a covered porch, a woodpile to one side that was taller than she was and twice as wide. A good woodpile, Eliza noted. Whatever else this man was, he was not going to let his children freeze. Rowan dismounted without a word and began unloading the pack mule. Eliza sat on her horse for a moment, looking at the cabin. Then the door opened. 3 children stood in the doorway. The oldest was a girl, maybe 14, Eliza guessed, with dark hair and her father's watchful gray eyes. Behind her, a boy of maybe 10, and behind him, a smaller boy, maybe 7, who was mostly hidden behind the older girl's arm. The girl was holding a shotgun. It was pointed with complete steadiness directly at Eliza's chest. Eliza did not move. She did not raise her hands. She held very still, the way you hold still for a large dog that hasn't decided yet what it thinks of you. And she looked at the girl over the barrel of the gun. The girl looked back. Her jaw was set. Her hands weren't shaking. "Who are you?" the girl said. "My name's Eliza." She kept her voice even. Not bright. A forced brightness would have been wrong here. She could feel it. Just even. "Your father brought me up from the settlement." "I know what he did." The barrel didn't move. Why'd you come? It was a more complicated question than it sounded. Eliza took a breath. I came because I didn't have much of a choice, she said, and because somebody needs to help with this winter. A beat of silence. The wind moved through the pines. We don't need help, the girl said. All right, Eliza said. Another beat. The girl's eyes narrowed slightly. She'd expected argument, not agreement. Eliza let the silence sit. From behind her, she heard Rowan's voice, flat and final. Put it down, Nora. The girl, Nora, held for one more second, a second that made its point. Then she lowered the gun with the careful competence of someone who'd been taught to use it properly, not recklessly, and she stepped back into the doorway without a word. Eliza released a breath she hadn't entirely known she was holding. She dismounted and tied the horse to the post at the edge of the porch. When she reached the door, the three children were ranged across the inside of it like a small, hostile parliament. I'm Eliza, she said again, looking at each of them in turn. The older boy, dark-haired like his sister, with a smear of something across his chin that might have been grease or mud or both, said nothing. The smallest boy looked at her from behind the older girl's arm with enormous dark eyes and said, in a very small voice, Are you going to be our mama? No, Eliza said honestly. I'm not. I'm just someone who's going to be here for a while. She looked at Nora. Nora looked back at her with the gray eyes that were her father's, and something in them that was her own. A sharpness, an assessment, a waiting. Is there wood for the fire? Eliza asked. A pause. Yes, Nora said. Good. Then let's get it going. It'll be dark in an hour. The inside of the cabin was what she'd expected, and worse than she'd expected in different measures. The structure was sound. Rowan built things to last and clearly kept to that principle. But the management of the space had the unmistakable quality of a household run by grief. There were pelts hung on every available hook, not arranged but accumulated. Dishes stacked in a rough order that suggested efficiency without care. A table and 4 mismatched chairs. A sleeping loft that she could see a ladder leading to. The main floor had a rope bed in the far corner, a larger one, that would be Rowan's, and nothing else that served as a bedroom. She would figure out the sleeping question later. There was a stone fireplace and the beginnings of a fire that hadn't been tended recently and was mostly coals. She got it going properly. Found the kitchen area, a section of counter, a cast iron stove, shelves with supplies in rough order. Salt. Dried beans. A small barrel of cornmeal, cured meat hanging from the ceiling on hooks. Enough for the winter, if managed carefully. She started managing it. The children watched her for a while. The oldest boy, she didn't have his name yet, eventually drifted outside. Nora stayed watching from a chair with the gun across her knees, which Eliza decided to treat as a normal situation. The smallest boy, Caleb, she would learn, followed Eliza around the kitchen at a distance of about 3 feet, close enough to watch but far enough to bolt if necessary. You know how to cook? Nora said eventually. Not friendly, not unfriendly, just a question. Yes. What's your best thing? Eliza thought about it honestly. Bean soup with a ham hock, though I can't promise you'll have those conditions every time. Something moved at the corner of Nora's mouth. Not a smile, just a movement. Papa can get the ham, she said. That's useful to know, Eliza said. Rowan came in an hour later, having stabled the horses and finished with the pack mule. He set a stack of supplies on the table without comment, washed his hands in the basin, looked at the fire going properly, looked at the activity at the stove, and then sat down in the chair nearest the door and began working on something with his hands. A length of rope, working it through some kind of knot with the focused mindlessness of long habit. He said nothing. She said nothing. The children ate the soup she made from what she found in the kitchen. Not her best work. She knew the space and the supplies too poorly for that. And for a while the only sounds were spoons against bowls and the fire and the wind outside, shaking the pine branches. After supper, Rowan pushed back from the table. Lofts for the children, he said. He was looking at the table when he said it. I sleep by the door. She looked at him. He looked at the table. And where do I sleep? She said. There's a pallet in the storage room. He still wasn't meeting her eyes. I'll put it by the stove. Warmer there. She thought about that. A separate room. A pallet by a stove. It wasn't what she'd feared. Not tonight, at least. Thank you, she said, and meant it more than the words could really carry. He made a sound that wasn't quite a response and went back to his rope. She lay on the pallet that first night listening to the mountain. It was different from town noise. Not quieter, exactly, just differently loud. The wind was its own language up here, the kind that got into the gaps around the window and talked through them in a low, continuous register. The pines cracked sometimes when the temperature dropped fast enough. An owl said something to another owl a long way off, and neither of them seemed to get an answer they were satisfied with. She was cold. The stove had been banked but not hot, and the storage room was a degree or two cooler than the main cabin. She curled the buffalo robe around herself and focused on the warmth she had, which was enough. She thought about the children. Nora, specifically, who had been the last one off the ladder to the loft, who had paused at the top and looked down at Eliza with those measuring gray eyes for a long moment before disappearing into the dark above. "We don't need help." That was what she'd said, from behind a shotgun. Eliza didn't take it personally. She understood it. If their mother had been gone 3 years, Nora had been managing since she was 11. She'd have found the systems. She'd have built the arrangements that kept things working. And now here was a stranger from the settlement threatening to disrupt all of it, handed to them without warning by a father who made decisions without consulting his children. Eliza would need to be careful with Nora. Not soft. Nora would smell softness and distrust it. But careful. Patient. She'd need to find the places where they could be useful to each other before she tried to find anything else. She thought about Rowan next. The man sleeping on his pallet, by the door, by his own description. The man who had bought her with her father's debt. She tested the word in her mind. Bought. It was the correct word, and she wasn't going to sand the edges off it, but he had not touched her. He had not looked at her in the way she'd braced for, the flat proprietary way that certain men looked at women they'd acquired. He'd looked at her the way you look at a situation, assessing it, identifying what it would require. She was a solution to a problem. She understood that. She could live with that, at least for now, because a problem to be solved was better than prey to be consumed, and she'd arrived prepared for the latter. She pulled the buffalo robe tighter. Outside, the mountain wind dropped for a moment, just a moment, and in the sudden absence of it, she heard a small sound from above, the creak of a child turning over in sleep, then quiet again. She closed her eyes. "Don't let the fear drive," her mother had said. She'd let it drive her this far. That was enough. She let herself sleep. She was up before anyone in the cabin the next morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. She learned the place the way you learn a difficult text. Slowly, from the beginning, reading for what was actually there rather than what you expected to find. She learned which floorboard squeaked and where the draft came through the wall by the window. She learned that the cornmeal had weevils starting in the back of the sack and needed to be sifted and the worst of it discarded before it ruined the rest. She learned that the axe had been rehung on its handle at a slightly wrong angle, which meant every split threw a little off to the left, which meant you got tired faster than you should. She fixed the axe handle on the 4th day, working the wedge tight with a mallet. Rowan came in from the trapping lines and saw her at it and stopped. She looked up. He looked at the axe, then at her. Then he walked past her into the cabin. He didn't say anything about it. But the next morning there was an extra pair of wool mittens laid near her outdoor boots, without note or explanation. They were too large for her hands, but they were warm, and she wore them. She learned Caleb first. Caleb was the easy one, 7 years old and starved for someone to talk to. He attached himself to her with the straightforward trust of small children who haven't yet learned to curate their affection. He told her everything. He told her about his dog that had died last spring, and about the fish he'd caught in the creek in the summer, and about how Nora had once killed a rabbit with a rock when they ran out of shot. He told her his mother's name had been Helen and that she'd smelled like pine soap, and he delivered this information with the same conversational lightness as the rabbit story, the way small children sometimes deliver enormous things, not because they don't feel them, but because they haven't built the apparatus yet to know they need to be handled carefully. Eliza listened to all of it. She didn't fill the pauses with false warmth, and she didn't treat any of it as more or less than it was. She just listened, and when Caleb ran down, she gave him small tasks that made him feel useful. Stirring the pot, carrying small loads of wood, holding the other end of a length of fabric she was mending. The middle boy, Jesse, she learned, was harder. He was 10 and had his father's quality of silence. Not comfortable silence, but defended silence. A boy who had decided that the best strategy for managing uncertainty was to say as little as possible, and therefore give as little away as possible. He did his chores without being asked and without complaint, which was either good discipline or suppressed desperation, and she wasn't sure yet which. She made a point of noticing when Jesse did things, not praising loudly. That would have embarrassed him. Just noticing. Firewood stacked neat, she'd say, without looking at him, and move on. She watched him, in her peripheral vision, absorb that without reacting to it, and file it somewhere. Nora was the project. Nora ran the household in her way. There was a system, even if it wasn't particularly efficient, a way the dishes were done, a way the laundry was handled, a particular logic to how things were organized on the shelves. Eliza didn't touch any of it for the first week. She worked beside the existing system, not against it, asking Nora's permission for each adjustment as if she were a guest in the house rather than an installed fixture. "Could I reorganize the shelf with the cooking supplies?" she asked one morning. "I'd put things back the same way if you prefer it." Nora looked at the shelf. "What would you change?" "The salt's too close to the stove. It'll pull moisture. Better against the inner wall." A pause. "All right," Nora said. "Small things, slow things." She didn't push for more than each day could hold. At the end of her second week on the mountain, Eliza was splitting wood in the cold, clear air of mid-afternoon, when she heard the horses come back and knew from the sound of it, the pace, the weight, that Rowan was back from his lines earlier than usual. She kept splitting. She'd gotten decent at it. Her hands were already starting to change, the soft inside skin going rough and pink, calluses beginning to form at the bases of her fingers. It was not pleasant. She'd decided to treat it as useful information about what the mountain required. Rowan put the horses up. He came out of the barn and walked past her toward the woodpile and stopped. She split a log, set up another. "You're wasting effort," he said. She looked up. I was watching her with those flat gray eyes. "You're muscling it. That's not where the power comes from." He walked over, and for a moment she had the instinctive full-body awareness of him being large and close, which she controlled into stillness. He picked up a piece of unsplit wood and set it on the block. "Hips, then shoulders. The axe does the work if you position it right." He demonstrated. Once. The wood split clean. She watched. "All right," she said. Try it." She tried it. It was better. Not as clean as his. She didn't have his mass, but notably better. "Wrists loose," he said. She adjusted. He watched for 3 more swings, made a sound that might have been assessment, and then walked into the cabin. It was the longest conversation they'd had since the ride up. She kept splitting, using the new technique, and she thought that you could probably learn a lot about a person from how they taught things, whether they talked at you or with you, whether they showed contempt for your ignorance or just corrected it. Rowan had corrected without contempt. It didn't mean anything conclusive, but she noted it. By the end of the month, she had developed a tentative mapping of Rowan Creed. He was not what the stories had built. The stories had made him a brute, a man-shaped force of violence and danger. And the violence was real, she didn't doubt that. You could see it in his body the way you see a river's power, not when it's flooding, but when it's contained, the potential of it banked behind muscle and stillness. He was capable of terrible things. She was not naive about that. But the brute part was wrong. A brute wouldn't have repaired her boot sole without being asked. She'd found it one morning waiting by the door, the flapping sole stitched tight with heavy thread, the work done in the night while she slept because he'd apparently noticed the sound it made and solved the problem without commentary. She hadn't said thank you. She'd understood by then that thank you made him uncomfortable in a way she couldn't entirely read, so she'd just pulled the boot on and let the good work speak for itself. A brute wouldn't have. On a morning when the cold hit particularly hard and she came to the kitchen to find the stove already burning and a pot of coffee already made, looked up from his work and said, "Cold front. Thought you'd want it warm," and then looked away before she could respond. I wasn't kind. She wouldn't use that word. Kindness implied softness, and Rowan Creed did not do soft. But there was something operating in him beneath the silence, a sense of obligation toward people who were in his sphere, a refusal to let people under his roof suffer what he could prevent. It wasn't warmth. It was something older and more reliable than warmth. She was still frightened of him, in the low-grade, ongoing way that felt less like acute fear and more like respect for a thing's potential energy. She didn't think she'd stop being frightened of him, but fear, she was learning, was not the only thing the situation contained. On a Tuesday in the last week of the month, she was mending a tear in one of Jesse's shirts, and Caleb was at the table drawing pictures of something complicated that he was narrating in a semi-continuous murmur, and the fire was going properly, and the smell of the venison stew she'd made from Rowan's recent kill was moving through the whole cabin, and Nora came down from the loft and looked at the room for a moment before she sat down and picked up the sock she was darning. For a while, none of them said anything. Nora said, without looking up from the darning, "Mama used to put dried rosemary in the venison." Eliza looked at her. Nora was not looking at her. She was looking at the sock. "I'll look for some in the spring," Eliza said, "if there's a place to find it." "There is," Nora said. "I'll show you." Oh, she went back to the darning. Eliza went back to the shirt. And across the room, Caleb continued his narration about his complicated drawing, and the fire burned, and the wind moved through the pines outside. It wasn't peace. Not yet. But it was something that peace might eventually grow from, the way things grew in hard country. Slow, unlikely, and stubborn against all odds. Harlan Pike arrived in the second month. She heard the horse first, then heard Rowan's chair move. Not quietly, a scraping sound that meant he'd stood fast. And by the time she came from the storage room where she'd been taking inventory, Rowan was already at the window, looking out with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. It was the expression of a man who has put something between himself and a problem and is watching that problem show up anyway. "Who is it?" she asked. "Nobody you want to meet." The door didn't knock. It opened. Harlan Pike was roughly Rowan's height, but built lean and loose, the kind of lean that suggested deprivation more than fitness. A man who had spent a long time in places with insufficient food and made himself mean to compensate. He had a beard that needed attention and eyes that were a pale shade of brown that somehow managed to be colder than the mountain air. He came in like he owned the floor and looked around the cabin with the evaluative sweep of a man taking stock. Then his eyes found Eliza. She saw the precise moment his expression changed. "Creed," he said, his voice carrying that easy, performative warmth of a man who has learned to use charm as an instrument. "Heard you'd acquired yourself some domestic help." "What do you need, Harlan?" Rowan's voice was flat. "Just stopping through. Weather coming. Thought I'd see if you could spare some supplies." "I'll get you what I can spare." He said it deliberately. "What I can spare." He was already moving toward the supply shelf. Harlan Pike didn't move toward the supply shelf. He moved toward Eliza, stopping at a distance that was one careful step inside the boundary of comfort, and she felt the full weight of his attention like a hand she hadn't consented to. "I don't think we've been introduced," he said. "I'm Eliza." She kept her voice level. She did not take a step back. "Eliza." He said it like he was tasting it. "How long you been up here?" "A while." "I bet this company gets lonely." He smiled. It didn't reach the pale eyes. "I run a camp up the North Ridge. Few men up there get a little starved for company, if you take my meaning. I imagine you could—" She didn't let him finish. It wasn't bravery exactly. It was the recognition that letting him finish would mean having heard it, and she didn't want to have heard it. "I'm not available for hire," she said. His smile stayed on, but changed quality. "That's not for you to say, sweetheart, is it? Way I heard it, Creed bought your contract from old Thomas Hale, which means—" His hand closed around her wrist. She moved on instinct. The cast iron pan was on the stove beside her. Her hand found the handle without looking. But she didn't use it. She didn't get the chance. The sound Rowan Creed made when he crossed the room was not a sound she had a name for. Not a shout, not a roar. More like the sound a structure makes when something fundamental inside it gives way. In the space of 2 seconds, Harlan Pike's hand was no longer on her wrist. Harlan Pike was no longer on his feet, and Rowan was standing over him with an expression that was completely empty of anything except intention. "Get up," Rowan said. His voice was very quiet. Harlan Pike looked up at him from the floor. The smile was completely gone. "Get up," Rowan said again, "and walk out of this cabin and don't come back to this ridge." A long moment. Nobody moved. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind had picked up. Harlan Pike got up slowly, with the careful movements of a man who has correctly assessed the situation and is making the only intelligent decision available to him. He walked to the door. He didn't say anything. The door closed behind him. The cabin was very quiet. Eliza set the cast iron pan back on the stove. Her hands were steady. She was surprised to notice that. She turned. Rowan was still standing where he'd stopped, breathing slowly, something in his jaw that was working to release. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. The empty expression was fading back into the flat gray default. "He won't come back," Rowan said. "I know." She held his gaze for a moment. "But thank you anyway." He muttered a sound that wasn't quite a word, and walked to the door and stood there with his hand on the frame, looking out into the late afternoon. She thought he might say something. He didn't. She went back to her inventory. But as she worked, the thought settled over her, quiet and significant. The most dangerous man on this mountain had just used every ounce of that danger on her behalf. She wasn't sure yet what that meant, but she held it, the way you hold something whose weight you haven't fully assessed, and she filed it away in the part of herself that was still trying to understand where she was. And what, and who, she had been brought here to survive. After Harlan Pike rode off the ridge, the cabin settled back into its usual rhythms, the way water settles after a stone's been thrown, slowly, with ripples still moving underneath the surface. Rowan didn't mention what had happened. He never mentioned it. He simply went back to checking his gear, then took himself to bed early without supper, which Eliza had come to understand was how he processed the things that cost him something to do. He went quiet, and he went still, and he worked it out alone in the dark, the same way the mountain worked out its weather. She didn't push. She cleaned up the kitchen, got Caleb through his evening routine, and lay on her pallet with the buffalo robe pulled up to her chin, listening to the wind and thinking about a man who had thrown another man across a cabin floor without a word of hesitation, and then stood there afterward looking almost bewildered by his own capacity for it. That was the contradiction she kept coming back to. Not the violence. She'd expected violence, at least as a possibility. It was what the violence had been for. Harlan Pike had put his hand on her like she was something to be appraised and borrowed, and Rowan Creed had ended that in 2 seconds flat. Not because she was his property to protect. At least, she didn't think that was all it was. It had looked less like possession and more like something that had tripped a wire in him, something older and less reasoned than ownership. She thought about it until she fell asleep, and she didn't have an answer when she woke up, so she got the fire going and started breakfast and let it sit unresolved, because some questions in hard country had to wait until the season was right for them. The real war inside the cabin wasn't between her and Rowan. It was between the cabin itself, soaked in the memory of the woman who had run it before, whose absence sat in every corner like a stain that had dried and set, and the fact that life kept on requiring things regardless. The fire needed feeding. The children needed feeding. The wood needed splitting, and the water needed hauling, and the hides Rowan brought back from the trap lines needed processing, which was a task she had never done before in her life and learned badly and slowly and with a great deal of quiet swearing in the storage room where nobody could hear her. Nora could have helped her with it. Nora knew how. Eliza could see it in the way the girl watched her struggling with the scraper, the precise angle she'd need, the places the hide was likely to tear if you were careless. But Nora didn't offer, and Eliza didn't ask, because asking Nora for help felt like a negotiation she hadn't earned the standing for yet. So she figured it out herself, badly at first, and then less badly, and by the third hide she was doing it well enough that it stopped being an emergency. Jesse found her at it one afternoon and stood in the doorway of the storage room watching for a long moment. He was holding a piece of harness leather he'd been mending. He was good with his hands, Jesse, careful and exacting in a way that made Eliza think of a much older person. "You've got the angle wrong," he said. She looked up. "Show me." He hesitated. Then he came in and showed her without a word of preamble, adjusting the scraper in her hands, with the brisk competence of someone who learned things by doing them and communicated the same way. She watched, corrected, tried again. "Better," he said, and went back to his harness. It was the first time Jesse had spoken to her without being directly spoken to first. She filed it under progress, though she was careful not to make anything of it out loud, which would have embarrassed him back into silence. The days had a shape now, even if the shape was brutal. Up before light, fire, breakfast. Chores that went from the practical to the physical again in an unrelenting sequence that left her so tired by evening that sleep came fast and without ceremony. She stopped dreaming, mostly, which was a relief. Her dreams in the first weeks had been of Caldwell Crossing, of her sisters, of the sound her father's chair made when he pushed back from the table, and those dreams left her waking with a kind of grief she didn't have time for. Now she woke up and she was just in the cabin, and that was that. Rowan came and went on his trap lines with a regularity that the weather only occasionally interrupted. He was gone before she was fully awake some mornings, back by mid-afternoon on good days, later when the snow was bad, or when something on the lines had gone wrong. He didn't explain his schedule, and she didn't ask for it. She simply kept food warm and didn't comment on the hour. What she noticed, slowly and with some surprise, was that he adjusted his habits to accommodate hers in small ways he never announced. The first time she'd needed to haul water from the creek in early morning, a job that required breaking the surface ice and involved a good chance of getting wet in temperatures that punished wet. She'd come outside to find the ice already broken and the first 2 barrels already filled, sitting on the porch. He'd done it before dawn, before she was up, without a word. She'd stood there in the gray early light looking at those barrels for a moment, and something had moved through her that she couldn't quite classify. It kept happening, small things. A problem would appear, a loose shutter that banged in the night wind, a gap in the cabin wall where cold was getting through, a section of the porch that had gone soft and dangerous underfoot, and without conversation, it would be fixed, not by her. She hadn't fixed those things. One evening she came to the main room and found him working on the loose shutter by lantern light, the children already in the loft. She stopped in the doorway. "I was going to do that," she said. He kept working. "You've got enough to do." She watched him for a moment. "How do you know what I've got to do?" "I pay attention," he said. Simple as that. She stood in the doorway a little longer than she needed to, and then she went to bed. He paid attention. That was the thing. The man who said almost nothing and looked at almost no one was somehow watching everything. She'd catch it sometimes. A glance she wasn't supposed to notice, lasting about half a second and then gone, the way a fish surfaces and disappears before you can be sure of what you saw. He was watching her with the children. He was watching how she managed the supplies. He was watching, she thought, for something specific, some piece of evidence that would settle the question he was apparently still asking. She didn't know what question. She wasn't entirely sure she wanted to. The children were changing, not dramatically. This wasn't a storybook transformation. Jesse was still defended, and Nora was still watchful, and Caleb was still Caleb, who would have attached himself warmly to a fence post if it had been willing to listen. But the specific texture of the resistance had changed. Jesse stopped leaving the room when she entered it. Nora stopped responding to every suggestion with a one-beat pause that said, "I'm considering whether to allow this." Caleb had started sleeping with a worn piece of quilt that Eliza had stitched back together for him, carrying it around the cabin with the solemn attachment of small children to things that have been repaired with visible care. One morning, Nora was at the table working on her arithmetic. She was doing it herself, from a tattered primer that had seen better decades, because there was no school on this mountain, and there wouldn't be. And Eliza sat down across from her without asking and looked at what she was working on. "You've got the division wrong," Eliza said. "The last 3 problems." Nora looked at her with the gray eyes. "How do you know?" "I went to school until I was 15. Not fancy school, but school." She turned the primer around. "Look, you're not carrying the remainder." A pause. "Show me." So Eliza showed her, and Nora learned it with the swift, clean uptake of a smart person who has been operating without enough information, the way a fire takes when it finally gets sufficient air. They worked through it for an hour, Eliza explaining and Nora asking questions that were sharp and specific and revealed exactly how much she'd already taught herself. "Who taught you?" Eliza asked eventually. "Mama, until she—" Nora stopped, recalibrated. "For a few years. She must have been a good teacher." "She was." A pause that had weight in it. "She was good at most things." Eliza held that for a moment. "What was her name?" "Caleb told me Helen." "Helena." Nora said it precisely, as if correcting the diminutive was a small form of honoring. "Helena Marie Creed. That's a good name." Nora looked at her. There was something in the look that Eliza couldn't entirely read. Not hostility, not warmth, something in between that was maybe just honest assessment. "She would have liked you," Nora said finally. "She liked people who didn't make a fuss about hard things." Eliza didn't answer right away. She was aware that Nora had just given her something significant, and that the way she received it mattered. "That's one of the better things anyone said to me in a while," she said. Nora almost smiled. She turned back to her primer. The weeks wore on and the cold deepened, and December arrived the way December arrived in those mountains, without ceremony and without mercy. The kind of cold that turned the snow to a fine dry powder that blew sideways and got into everything, that cracked the skin at the corners of your eyes and made breathing outside feel like swallowing glass. Eliza's body adapted, the way bodies do when they have no alternative. Her circulation had become more efficient. She stopped losing feeling in her fingers quite as fast. She moved through the cold with the specific economy of someone who has learned that fighting it wastes heat you need. She and Rowan had developed a kind of language by now. Not warmth, exactly. Not friendship. But a functional literacy of each other that meant they rarely had to explain themselves twice. That she could read from the particular set of his shoulders when he came in from the trap lines whether he'd had a good run or a bad one, and he could apparently read from something, she never identified what, when she was at the end of her resources and needed the evening to be quiet. On those evenings he kept the children occupied, herding them up to the loft with a roughness that was not unkind, and she had the main room to herself for an hour, and she sat by the fire and just breathed. She was grateful for that. She was surprised to be grateful for it, and the surprise itself told her something, that she had stopped, without noticing when, expecting the worst from him as her default. One night, with the temperature outside somewhere that the thermometer's description of it felt almost inadequate, they were sitting in the main room after the children were in the loft. It happened sometimes, not often, but sometimes, that they were both in the room at the same time with nothing immediately requiring their hands, and the silence between them was less the absence of conversation and more a kind of companionship that didn't need conversation to be real. I was doing something with a length of wire. She was sewing. The fire was the good kind, the deep red kind that gives heat without drama. "Why'd you really come?" he said. She looked up. He wasn't looking at her. He was working the wire. "You know why," she said. "My father's debt. That's why he sent you." He kept his eyes on the wire. "That's not the same question." She thought about it. It deserved an honest answer. "Because I didn't have anything better to go to," she said. "And because I thought, whatever this was going to be, it was at least going to be something, not just more of what I was already doing." He was quiet for a moment. The wire moved through his fingers. "Was it what you expected?" he asked. "No," she said, "but I'm still here." He looked at her then, briefly. The flat gray eyes. Something in them she couldn't name, not warmth, not quite, but the shadow of something that warmth might eventually grow from, if the conditions were right. Then he looked back at the wire. "Good," he said. "Just that. Just the one word, delivered to the wire, to the fire, to the cold mountain air pressing against the walls of the cabin." She let it sit. She went back to her sewing, and he went back to his wire, and outside the mountain wind said whatever it had to say, and neither of them felt the need to say anything more. It wasn't love. She would not have called it that. It wasn't even close to that yet, and maybe it would never be. She'd stopped trying to project forward to what this was or wasn't going to become. But it was something true between them now, something that had been built the hard way, through difficult days and close quarters and crisis and patience, the way things got built out here that were worth the building. And when she finally banked the fire and took herself to the storage room and lay down on her pallet, she didn't lie awake cataloging fears. She lay awake for exactly as long as it took her body to let go of the day, which was not very long at all. The mountain kept its weather, the cabin kept its warmth. And somewhere up in the loft, one of the children was talking in their sleep. Caleb, she thought, that particular quality of murmur. And she listened to it for a moment with something she recognized eventually as peace. Not the absence of difficulty. There was plenty of difficulty still to come, and some part of her already knew it, the way the body knows a weather change before the sky shows it. But peace anyway. The stubborn, earned kind. The only kind worth having. Caleb got sick on a Thursday. She knew it before he said anything, before he complained or cried or did any of the things a child does to announce that something is wrong. She knew it the way you know things when you've been living close to someone for 2 months. From the particular quality of his silence at breakfast, from the way he left half his porridge untouched and didn't comment on it, from the fact that he didn't follow her to the kitchen afterward the way he usually did, trailing behind with whatever was on his mind that morning. She found him sitting in the chair by the fire with his quilt pulled around him, not playing, not talking, just sitting. And when she put her hand to his forehead, she felt the heat rising off him like a stone in afternoon sun. "How long have you felt this way?" she asked. He looked up at her with those dark eyes, heavy-lidded now and glassy at the edges. "Since last night," he said. "I didn't want to wake anybody. 7 years old and already apologizing for being sick. She felt something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with the cold. She got him back to his pallet in the loft and tucked the quilt around him and took his temperature the only way she had available. Her lips to his forehead, which told her it was high but not yet catastrophic. And then she came back downstairs and started thinking. By afternoon, he was coughing. Not a regular cough. Not the rough, productive cough of a chest cold working itself out. This was deeper than that, seated low in the lungs, with a rattling quality underneath it that she recognized from her grandmother's remedies book, and from the one time she'd heard it in a person, which was the winter she was 9 and old Mrs. Carey's youngest, had gotten the lung sickness, and everyone in 3 houses over could hear it through the walls at night. That child had survived. Not all of them did. She came downstairs and found Rowan sitting at the table, sharpening a blade with long, steady strokes, and she stood across from him and said, "Caleb's cough has gone to his chest." The sharpening stone stopped. He looked up at her, and for a moment his face did something she hadn't seen it do before. The controlled surface of it cracked, just slightly, the way ice cracks before it gives way. And underneath was something raw and badly frightened. "How bad?" he said. "I don't know yet. Bad enough that I need to know what you have in the house. Any camphor? Mustard powder? I need onions, definitely. Do you have dried thyme?" He was already moving before she finished asking. He went to shelves she hadn't known about, a section of the storage room she hadn't opened, which turned out to be a narrow cabinet built into the wall behind a hanging pelt. He pulled things out and set them on the table. Some of what she needed, not all. "No camphor," he said. "All right, I can work without it." She was pulling her grandmother's book from the shelf where she kept it, turning to the pages she'd already read so many times she could have recited them. She read them anyway, because this was not the moment for confidence. This was the moment for making sure. "I need water boiling, a lot of it, continuously, and I need you to build the fire up. More than usual, I want this room as warm as it can get." "Done," he said. He didn't ask why. He just did it. Nora appeared at the foot of the loft ladder, her face pale. "What's wrong with Caleb?" "He's sick," Eliza said. She kept her voice steady. "I'm going to work on it. I need you to keep Jessie up in the loft tonight and keep things calm up there. Can you do that?" Nora looked at her for a beat too long. The look of a girl who understood that the calibrated calm in Eliza's voice was exactly that, calibrated. And then she nodded. "Yes, good." Nora didn't go back up immediately. She stood at the foot of the ladder for another moment, and she said quietly, so only Eliza could hear, "When Mama got sick, her cough sounded like that." Eliza met her eyes. She didn't look away from it, and she didn't cover it over with false reassurance, because Nora was 14 and had already been lied to by Hope before. "I know," Eliza said. "I'm going to do everything I know how to do. That's all I can promise you." Nora held her gaze for another second. Then she climbed back up the ladder, and Eliza heard her speaking quietly to Jessie in the dark above. And she turned back to the table and the herbs and the boiling water and got to work. The treatment she assembled from her grandmother's book and her own hard-earned knowledge was not elegant. Nothing about medicine in this country was elegant. It was all improvisation and educated guessing, and the humbling awareness that you were working with incomplete information against something that didn't care about your intentions. She made a poultice from the mustard powder and lard, wrapped it in a square of flannel, and pressed it to Caleb's chest. She made a steam tent from a blanket and a pot of boiling water with dried thyme thrown in, and she held it over him while he breathed the vapor and coughed and cried a little from the discomfort of it. She made a tea from the onions she'd had Rowan slice, his eyes streaming silently over the cutting board in a way that might have been almost funny under any other circumstances. And she got it into Caleb in small sips between coughing fits. Rowan stayed. She hadn't asked him to, and she wouldn't have. She'd expected him to be in the way, one more thing to manage. He wasn't in the way. He was simply present in the way that large, quiet people can be present, occupying space without demanding it, doing whatever she told him to do without requiring explanation and without offering unsolicited opinion. When she needed another blanket, he had it. When the fire needed feeding, he fed it. When she needed to change the poultice and needed both hands, he held Caleb still, gently, with the particular care of a man who has handled fragile things and knows the difference between strong and rough, while she worked. Caleb looked up at his father during one of these moments, his small face shiny with fever sweat, and said, "Pa, I don't feel good." "I know," Rowan said. "Eliza's fixing it." The simplicity of it, The certainty of it, stated to his sick child without hedging, without qualification, landed somewhere in Eliza that she didn't have a name for. She kept her eyes on what she was doing. Midnight came and went. The fire burned high. The cabin was hot in a way it had never been since she arrived. A thick, medicinal heat, smelling of thyme and onion and mustard and fear. Outside, the temperature had dropped to something serious, and the wind was talking in a register that meant the next few days were going to be bad. Caleb's breathing worsened around 2 in the morning. The rattling went deeper, and he coughed until he gagged, and his small body heaved with the effort of it, and Eliza sat beside him with her hand on his back, feeling every one of those heaves move through him, and kept her face neutral and her voice calm and worked through every option she had available, and then started over and worked through them again. "Is it enough?" Rowan said. He was across the pallet from her, on the other side of his son. He wasn't looking at Caleb. He was looking at her. The question was completely direct. No preamble, no softening. Is it enough? She looked up at him. His face in the firelight was stripped of everything except that core frightened thing she'd seen crack through earlier, and it was fully visible now, no attempt to conceal it. This was not the mountain man who threw Harlan Pike across a room without blinking. This was a father, sitting beside his sick child in the dark, asking the one person present who might have an answer whether his child was going to live. She did not look away from him. "I don't know," she said. "I'm doing everything I can. I'm not done trying." He held her eyes for a moment. Something moved through his face that she couldn't interpret. Not anger, not blame, something more private than either. "Helena?" he started and stopped. "I know," Eliza said quietly. "Tell me what happened with her. The cough. How it progressed. It'll help me know what to watch for." I was quiet for a moment. She could see the cost of it, opening that particular door. But he did it. He told her in short, precise sentences. The way a man tells something he's only half processed. The details still sharp and unsmoothed because grief doesn't sand things down as evenly as people expect. Helena had started the same way. The dry heat, then the cough dropping into the chest, then 3 days where it seemed to stabilize and they'd thought it was turning. Then the 4th day it had gone bad fast, a kind of drowning from the inside, and there had been nothing. No remedies, no resources, no warning adequate to how quickly it moved. He stopped talking. The fire popped. 4 days, Eliza said. We're in the first 24 hours. Does that matter? Yes, we caught it early. I'm putting different things at it than you would have had available 3 years ago. It matters. She pressed the new poultice to Caleb's chest. Don't give up on the first night. I'm not giving up, he said. There was something in his voice, not defensiveness, but the kind of clarification that comes from a sore place. I just need to know if I should go for the settlement, get a doctor. In this weather, you'd be gone 2 days minimum, maybe 3. She shook her head. He needs consistent treatment, not someone showing up in 3 days. I need to be here, working on it continuously. If I need you to go, I'll tell you. He looked at her steadily. Then he nodded once and settled back. They worked through the night in shifts that weren't formally assigned but fell into a natural order. Eliza managing the treatments, adjusting and readjusting as Caleb's responses told her what was working and what wasn't, and Rowan doing everything the treatments required in terms of logistics, the continuous hot water, and the fire, and the blankets, and the hands when she needed them. Around 4 in the morning, she had Rowan hold Caleb upright while she worked through a set of percussive movements on his back, thumping firmly between the shoulder blades in a rhythm her grandmother had described as like you're helping the chest remember how to throw things out. It was imprecise medicine. It was what she had. Caleb endured it with the exhausted passivity of a very sick child, occasionally making small sounds of discomfort that she acknowledged and kept going through because stopping wasn't an option. Rowan watched her the entire time with an expression that was unreadable in a new way. Not the flat default blankness, not the frightened rawness of earlier. Something in between. Something that was trying to understand what it was looking at. Dawn came gray and colorless through the window, the light of a sky that had been doing heavy weather all night and wasn't finished. Eliza's back ached from hours of crouching. Her eyes felt as though they'd been sandpapered. She was operating on the particular clarity of extreme tiredness, past the foggy stage and into the sharp-edged stage where everything registered with too much precision. She changed the poultice one more time, made fresh tea, listened to Caleb's chest. The rattle was still there, but it had changed quality. Very slightly. Not gone, not even clearly better, but different. The deepest, most waterlogged note of it had shifted. She sat back on her heels. She pressed both hands flat on her knees and breathed. "What?" Rowan said. He was watching her face. "I'm not sure yet," she said, carefully. "Give it another hour." The hour passed. She listened again. And then, a little after 7 in the morning, Caleb had a coughing fit that was prolonged and violent and awful to hear, that had Rowan half rising with his hands extended in the instinct to do something, anything. And when it finally broke, the quality of the boy's breathing was different again. Cleaner. The rattle had moved upward, which meant it was moving out. She put her hand to his forehead, still hot, but not climbing. She sat down fully on the floor beside the pallet, her legs no longer willing to manage the other arrangements, and she put her face in her hands and she did not cry. She was too empty for that. She just sat there for a moment in the dark behind her palms and let herself feel the full weight of the night before it passed. She felt a hand on her shoulder. She looked up. Rowan was crouching beside her, and his hand was on her shoulder, and he was looking at her with those gray eyes that had something entirely new in them, something she'd never seen there before and didn't have a word for, but that was not nothing. "He's going to be all right," she said. Her voice came out rough. "It's moving the right direction. He'll need days of continued treatment, but the worst, I think the worst is through." Rowan looked at her for a long moment. His hand was still on her shoulder. She was aware of the weight of it, the warmth of it through the fabric of her dress, and she didn't move away from it. "I don't know how to," he started. Stopped. Something moved across his face. He was not a man who reached easily for words, and this particular feeling was apparently beyond the range of his usual vocabulary. "What you did tonight." "Don't," she said, not unkindly. "You would have done the same." "I wouldn't have known what to do," he said. It came out with a plainness that was clearly the truth and clearly cost him something to say. A man who prided himself on competence, admitting a limit. "I would have just—" He stopped again. "I didn't know what to do." She looked at him steadily, at the lines in his face that were partly weather and partly something older, the marks of years that had asked a great deal of him and not always given much back. "You did everything I asked," she said. "That was everything." He held her eyes for one more moment. Then he did something she hadn't expected and couldn't have predicted. He reached out and took her hand, briefly, the way you might take someone's hand when language has given out entirely, and there's nothing else that covers it. His hand was enormous around hers, scarred and rough and warm. He held it for 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then he let go and stood up and walked to the fire and began feeding it wood with his back to her. And she could see by the set of his shoulders that whatever had just crossed his face was being put away now, carefully, back behind the wall where he kept things. She sat on the floor a moment longer. Then she got up and checked on Caleb, who had fallen into a real sleep now. Not the fevered unconscious of the night, but actual sleep, the healing kind. And she adjusted his blankets and pushed the damp hair off his forehead and let herself feel, for just a moment, the simple relief of a child still breathing. From above, she heard the loft ladder creak. Nora came down, took one look at the room, at Caleb sleeping, at Eliza standing beside him, and something on the girl's face came undone. Not dramatically. Nora didn't do dramatic. Just a brief visible release, a loosening around the eyes, that was there and then contained again in less than a second. "He's better," Eliza said. Nora nodded. She came and stood beside Eliza and looked down at her little brother for a moment, and then she said very quietly, "Thank you." Eliza didn't answer. She put her arm around Nora's shoulders briefly, and Nora, who would have pulled away 2 months ago, who had made an art form of not needing anything, leaned in, just slightly, just for a moment, before she straightened back up and went to help with breakfast. Outside, the blizzard kept its promise. Snow came down in quantities that made the window useless as a source of light, and the wind hit the cabin walls with a regularity that was almost like breathing, the mountain's own particular rhythm. But inside the fire burned, and the child slept, and the coffee Rowan made was strong enough to stand a spoon in, which was exactly what the morning required. She drank it standing at the stove, both hands around the cup, too tired to sit, and she thought about nothing in particular for a while, which was its own form of rest, the hardest night on the mountain so far. She'd survived it. More importantly, Caleb had survived. And something else had happened in the course of it, something she couldn't fully articulate yet, some rearrangement of the landscape between herself and the man standing on the other side of the cabin, silent as always, but differently silent now. Not closed, not walled, Just quiet, the way things are quiet when they've said what needed saying and are waiting to see what comes next. Caleb recovered slowly, the way children recover from serious illness. Not in a clean upward line, but in an uneven, frustrating progression of better days, followed by days that seemed to slide backward before finding the path again. He'd be up and eating and following Eliza around the kitchen on a Tuesday, and then spend Thursday with the fever creeping back and the cough returning in a diminished but still frightening echo of itself. She adjusted the treatments each time without panic, watching him the way her grandmother had taught her to watch illness. Not the surface of it, but the direction of it, the overall arc rather than the daily variation. By the end of the second week, he was sitting up playing with the carved wooden figures Jesse had quietly produced from somewhere, lining them up on his quilt in elaborate arrangements that he narrated to himself in a running undertone. The fever was gone. The cough was a remnant, a dry and occasional thing that would probably linger another month before it was truly finished. Rowan had watched the recovery with the contained intensity of a man slowly releasing a breath he'd been holding for days. He didn't say much about it. He expressed relief the way he expressed most things, through action, through the particular quality of his presence in the cabin, shifting back from that raw, stripped-open vigilance into something more like its usual steadiness. But it wasn't quite the same steadiness as before. Something had rearranged itself in him during those long night hours beside his son's pallet, and whatever it was, it hadn't rearranged itself back. He talked more. Not dramatically more. This was not a man who was ever going to fill a room with conversation. But in the evenings now, he would sometimes say things that weren't strictly functional. He told Jesse, one night, a story about a wolverine he'd encountered on the trap lines years ago that had outsmarted him 3 times running before he'd finally managed to outwit it. And there was something in the telling, a dry, self-deprecating thread running through it, that made Jesse laugh outright, a real laugh, startled out of him. It was the first time Eliza had heard Jesse laugh. She kept her eyes on her sewing and said nothing, but she held the sound of it somewhere private. He asked Eliza another evening about her mother. Just that directly. What was she like? Your mother. She looked up from what she was doing, surprised enough by the question that she didn't have time to decide how to answer it, which meant she answered it honestly. She told him about a woman who had been practical and funny in a dry way that most people missed, who had kept a garden in soil that barely deserved the name, who had known the medicinal properties of every plant within walking distance, and had passed that knowledge to Eliza with the deliberate intention of a woman who understood that knowledge was the one thing nobody could take from you. She told him about the way her mother had smelled, lye soap and dried lavender, always, and about the time she'd faced down a creditor twice her size with nothing but a wooden spoon and a complete absence of fear, and she heard her own voice doing something while she talked that it hadn't done in a long time, softening around the edges of the memory instead of bracing against it. Rowan listened the way he did most things, completely, without interruption, watching her face with the gray eyes that missed very little. She sounds like someone worth knowing, he said when she finished. She was, Eliza said. A pause. The fire. The usual mountain wind doing its usual business outside. You got a lot of her, he said. He said it quietly, almost to himself, and he looked away after, back to whatever was in his hands, and she understood that he hadn't entirely meant to say it aloud, and that making anything of it would embarrass them both. So she said nothing. But she kept it. January went deep and brutal in the way January on that mountain had apparently been doing since long before any of them arrived on it. The snow accumulated in quantities that changed the landscape outside the cabin windows into something featureless and enormous, the tree lines reduced to dark suggestions at the edges of a white expanse that had its own strange beauty if you weren't also trying to survive in it. Rowan dug out the path from the cabin to the barn every morning, and it was filled back in by afternoon. He stopped fighting it and started managing it, a different set of priorities for which paths mattered most and which ones could wait. Eliza's body had changed in ways she noticed in moments when she caught her reflection in the single small mirror in the storage room. Her face was different, not older exactly, but more defined, like a sketch that's been worked over and the important lines made darker. Her hands were nothing like what they'd been in Caldwell Crossing. They were working hands now, the kind her mother had had, the kind that told a story without a word. She was stronger, not just physically, though she was that genuinely, in ways that surprised her sometimes when she hauled a barrel or split a particularly difficult length of knotted wood. She was stronger in some other way that was harder to measure, something in the core of how she met difficulty. She'd stopped waiting for things to get easier. She'd started just working with what was. The children were different too. Jesse had lost the specific guardedness that had made him seem, in those first weeks, like a much smaller person wrapped in a much larger silence. He was still quiet, that was his nature, probably always would be. But it was a quieter quiet now, the kind that came from contentment rather than defense. He'd started teaching Caleb to carve, the two of them sitting by the fire in the evenings with small knives and pieces of pine, Jesse instructing in the terse, precise way he did everything, Caleb chattering through the lesson and somehow absorbing it anyway. Nora was the one who surprised her most. The girl who had pointed a shotgun at her chest on the first day had become, incrementally and without ceremony, something close to a partner. They ran the household together now, in a genuine collaboration that didn't require discussion because they'd learned each other's rhythms, who handled which tasks, who made which decisions, where one left off and the other picked up. Nora still had her father's quality of assessment, that watching, measuring attention, but it was directed outward now instead of at Eliza, turned toward the problems of the day rather than the problem of whether Eliza was safe to trust. One morning, working beside each other over the wash, Nora said without preamble, "I want to learn more medicine, what you did with Caleb." Eliza wrung out a piece of cloth. "I can teach you what I know, which isn't everything. More than nothing." "True." She looked at Nora. "We can start with the book. Some of it's hard to read. The handwriting's difficult. I'll figure it out." Eliza believed her. "After the wash," she said. They started that afternoon going through the remedies book page by page, Eliza translating the cramped handwriting and explaining the reasoning behind each treatment, while Nora listened with her total focused attention and asked the kind of questions that revealed she was already 3 steps ahead, already extrapolating, already thinking about what she'd do when the specific situation described didn't match exactly what was in front of her. She was going to be good at it. Better than good, maybe. It was mid-February when the avalanche happened. She heard it from inside the cabin, a sound she'd never heard before and recognized immediately as wrong, a deep concussive rumble that was too sustained to be thunder and too rhythmic to be whined, rolling down from the upper ridge with a quality of mass and finality that made the cabin walls shudder slightly in sympathy. She was at the stove. She put down what she was holding. Rowan had left that morning for the upper trap lines. The same upper ridge. Nora was at the table. Their eyes met. "That was the upper ridge," Nora said. "Yes." A beat of silence. "He knows the mountain," Nora said. She was saying it the way you say things when you're talking yourself into a position, building the case. "He's been on it 20 years. He'd know if there was risk of—" "Yes," Eliza said again. She was already moving, coat, gloves, her heaviest boots. She went to the corner where the emergency gear was kept. Rope, the small hand axe, the fire kit in its waterproof pouch. And she began checking and assembling with the focused speed of someone who has decided on a course of action and is past the point of deliberation. "You can't go up there," Nora said. She had stood up from the table. Her voice was controlled, but the control was clearly costing her. "You don't know the upper lines. You don't know where he'd have been. Do you?" A beat. "Yes," Nora said. "Then you're going to tell me before I leave." "I'm going with you." "No." Eliza pulled the rope coil over her shoulder. "You're staying here with the boys. If something happens to both of us—" She didn't finish that sentence. She didn't need to. Nora stared at her. The gray eyes doing their assessment work, and this time what they were assessing was Eliza's capacity and her seriousness, measuring both against the size of what was outside. "Northwest from the tree line," Nora said finally. "Follow the creek bed until you hit the boulder field. His lines run through the pines on the east side of it. That's where he'd have been this morning." "How far?" "Hour. Maybe more in this snow." Eliza looked at Nora's face. All the things sitting in it, fear and the discipline she was putting over fear, and something underneath both that was maybe the first fully unguarded look Nora had ever given her. "I'll bring him back," Eliza said. She went out into the cold. The world outside the cabin had been rearranged by the avalanche. Even at this distance from the upper ridge, she could see the way the snowfield on the high slope had changed shape, the clean contour of it replaced by a rougher, collapsed topography. She didn't let herself think about what that meant for a man who had been somewhere in the middle of it. She just moved, The snow was deep and uneven, the kind that looked manageable on the surface and then suddenly dropped you into the hip with no warning, and she moved through it with the steady, unglamorous labor of a woman who had been building physical strength for 4 months in the hardest school available. She was winded within the first 20 minutes. She kept going. She found the creek bed and followed it northwest, past ice-covered rocks and the skeletal winter forms of brush that would be green come spring. The temperature was dropping as the afternoon light changed. She could feel it in her face, in the exposed skin around her eyes, a sharpening that meant she had a limited window before the cold became its own problem on top of everything else. She reached the boulder field and turned east into the pines. She found him 40 minutes later. I was partly visible. One arm and part of his shoulder above the surface, the rest of him pinned beneath a shattered pine that had come down from the slope above with enough force to drive it 2 feet into the packed snow and whatever was underneath. He was conscious, barely. His face was the color of old ash, and there was blood in the snow around him in a quantity that tightened her whole chest into something small and cold. Rowan. She was already down on her knees beside him, her hands moving over what she could reach, assessing. "Where are you hurt? Tell me what you feel." His eyes found her face. For a moment they were unfocused, looking at her from a great distance. Then they sharpened. "Eliza." His voice was a wreck. "What the—" He coughed, and the cough clearly cost him. "You shouldn't be up here." "I know. Where does it hurt?" My leg, something in my leg." His jaw tightened. "The tree's got my side." She looked at the tree. A mature pine, the trunk thick as her waist, lying at an angle that told her it had hit him on the way down and dragged him partially under as it settled. The weight of it was not what was going to kill him. He'd managed to keep his upper body clear enough to breathe. But he couldn't move, and the temperature was going to kill him if she didn't change the situation in the next hour. "I'm going to get you out," she said. "You can't move that tree." "I'm not going to move the tree." She was already untying the rope from her shoulder, already looking at the available geometry. The standing pines around her, the angles, the leverage points. She'd watched Rowan work with ropes often enough to understand the principles. "I'm going to make the tree move itself." She worked fast, which meant she worked imprecisely, which meant she had to redo 2 of the anchor points when they didn't hold the way she'd planned, cursing under her breath each time, with a specificity that she was dimly aware would have surprised the girl she'd been in Caldwell Crossing. She got the rope looped around the downed trunk, ran it to a standing pine at the angle that would lever the trunk rather than drag it, tested the tension. "This is going to hurt," she said. "Most things do," Rowan said. She pulled. It was the kind of physical effort that she would not be able to fully account for afterward, her body producing something beyond its apparent capacity through the specific mechanism of having no alternative. The rope went taut, the standing pine groaned, and the downed trunk shifted. Not much. Not enough on the first pull. She repositioned, changed her angle slightly, and pulled again, and this time the trunk rose 3 inches at the point where it crossed Rowan's body, and he made a sound she would carry for a long time, short and controlled, the sound of pain that's being allowed the minimum of expression and no more. "Move," she said through her teeth. "Move yourself. I can't hold this." He moved. She felt the resistance in the rope change as his weight came out from under the trunk, and she held it through burning arms and legs that were shaking with the effort, until he said, "Clear." And she released, and the trunk dropped back into the snow with a sound like a muffled shot. She went to him. He was on his back in the snow, breathing hard, his face gray and sweating despite the cold. She did a fast check. The leg was bad. She could see the wrong angle of it even through the heavy trouser fabric. Ribs, probably, on the left side. The bleeding was from a gash on his forearm that had soaked through his sleeve. She dealt with the bleeding first, tied her scarf tight above it. Then she built a small fire. It took 3 attempts with hands that were shaking from exertion. Not for warmth. There wasn't time for warmth, but for light. And because having a fire meant she'd made a decision, and the decision was, "We are not dying here." "You came up alone," Rowan said. He was watching her work on the fire. "You'd already established that." "Into avalanche terrain." "Yes, Rowan. That was—" He stopped. "Necessary," she said. "It was necessary." She looked at him. "Can you stand on the good leg if I support your weight?" "Probably." "That's what we've got to work with then." Getting him back to the cabin took everything she had. He was not a small man under the best circumstances, and this was nowhere near the best circumstances, and the snow that had been merely difficult on the way out was treacherous on the way back with his weight against her. She took it in sections, from one landmark to the next, not allowing herself to think about the total distance, or the fading light, or the temperature. Just this tree to that rock. Just that rock to the creek bend. Just the creek bend to the tree line below the cabin. I was silent for most of it, which was its own kind of concern. She'd have preferred him talking, arguing, telling her she was doing it wrong. The silence meant he was conserving everything he had just for the moving. She kept her arm around his torso, her shoulder under his arm, and she did not stop. The light was almost gone when the cabin came into view. She saw the door open before they reached the porch. Nora had been watching. The girl came down the steps and got herself under Rowan's other arm without a word, and the three of them got up the steps and through the door, and the warmth of the cabin hit them both like something physical. They got him onto the rope bed. He hadn't been in it since she arrived. He'd always taken the floor pallet by the door, and the wrongness of him lying in it now, injured and gray-faced, hit her with a wave of something she didn't examine too closely. She just started working. Jesse had water heating already. She hadn't asked him to. He'd just done it, read the situation from Nora's face or from some other signal she hadn't seen, and done what was needed. She looked at him across the cabin for 1 second, and he looked back, and then they both went back to what they were doing. She cleaned the arm wound and stitched it. Rowan held still through all of it with a quality of iron self-discipline that she found simultaneously admirable and concerning, and wrapped the ribs as tightly as she dared, and looked at the leg and made the determination that the bone wasn't broken through, just badly torqued, and splinted it with the firm efficiency of someone who has given herself no room for squeamishness. When she was done, the cabin was quiet except for the fire. Rowan was propped on the pillows, his arm bandaged, his face slowly returning to something closer to its natural color. Caleb had inserted himself onto the edge of the bed, pressed against his father's good side, small and warm and present, in the way that small children are present, which requires nothing and offers everything. Rowan looked at Eliza across the cabin. She was at the wash basin cleaning her hands, her back aching from the hours of effort, her shoulders a kind of tired that went past muscle into something cellular. "Why?" he said. She looked over her shoulder at him. "Why what?" "Why'd you come up there, alone? You could have waited. I might have gotten free on my own." She turned back to the basin, wrung out the cloth, thought about the question, and gave it the honest answer it deserved. "You wouldn't have," she said. "Not before the temperature finished you." She dried her hands. "And because—" She paused. "Because you're— This is my home now. You and these children, whatever it started as." She said it to the basin, not to him. It was easier that way. "You don't leave your people in the mountain." Silence from the bed. Long enough that she thought he wasn't going to respond, which was all right. She'd said it because it was true, not because she needed him to answer it. Then he said quietly, "No, you don't." Just that. But the way he said it, the weight that was in it, the particular frequency of it, she understood that he wasn't just agreeing with a principle. He was saying something else entirely, something he didn't have the words for and probably wouldn't try to find, not tonight, maybe not for a long time. She turned around and looked at him. He looked back. The fire lit the room in amber, and the wind outside was doing what it always did, and the children were settling into their evening, Caleb murmuring something against his father's side, and Jesse quietly moving through the cabin, putting things in order. And for a moment, everything was simply what it was. Not perfect, not resolved, not without its weight and its difficulty. But hers. Fully and completely hers. She had come up this mountain as a debt. She had come as $40 and an old mule in the absence of any better option. And somewhere between the first night on a cold pallet and this moment standing in the amber firelight with aching shoulders and a man watching her from the bed she'd just hauled him back to, somewhere in that cold and difficult space, she had become someone she hadn't known she was capable of being. Not a different person, the same person, just, finally, given room enough to be all of herself. She went to the stove and started supper. Behind her, the cabin breathed its familiar breath, and the mountain held them all inside it, and the winter still had weeks left in it, and none of that frightened her any more the way it once had. She was still here. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. Rowan healed the way he did everything, stubbornly, impatiently, and with a complete disregard for the timeline Eliza set for him. She told him 3 weeks off the leg. He was testing weight on it at 10 days, holding onto the doorframe and doing it when he thought she wasn't looking, which she always was. She didn't confront him directly. She'd learned that direct confrontation with Rowan Creed on matters of his own body produced nothing except a wall. So she simply made sure the things he would need to do outside were already done before he got the chance, which frustrated him considerably more effectively than an argument would have. "The east fence line needs checking," he said one morning, standing at the window and looking out with the cooped-up expression of a man who has been inside for 11 days and is approaching the outer limit of his tolerance for it. "Jesse checked it yesterday," Eliza said, without looking up from the bread she was kneading. A pause. "The snare lines on the lower ridge. Done this morning." Another pause. "Eliza." "Rowan." He turned from the window. She could feel him looking at the back of her head with an expression she didn't need to see to know precisely. "I'm not an invalid," he said. "I know that." She turned the bread. "You're a man with a badly torqued leg and 2 cracked ribs who has been off his lines for less than 2 weeks and thinks that's long enough because staying still makes him miserable, which I understand. But you going back out early and damaging that leg properly would mean 6 weeks instead of 2, so." She looked up at him. "Sit down." He looked at her for a long moment, the gray eyes doing their usual unreadable work. Then he sat down. She went back to the bread. Behind her, she heard him pick up the length of harness he'd been repairing from the inside, the small sounds of his hands finding work, and something in the room settled back into its equilibrium. It had become a different kind of quiet between them since the avalanche. Not the functional quiet of 2 people managing logistics, and not the careful quiet of the early months when they were both measuring their words against the possibility of saying something wrong. This was the quiet of people who have been through something together and come out the other side of it, knowing each other better than most people manage after years. There was an ease in it that she hadn't anticipated and didn't entirely know what to do with. He told her things now. Not everything. Rowan was never going to be a man who opened himself all the way to anyone, and she'd stopped wanting that, having recognized it as both impossible and unnecessary. But things. He told her about coming to this mountain 22 years ago with nothing except a winter's supply of food and a determination to build something real. He told her about the first winter alone, which had nearly broken him, and about the second winter, which hadn't, and about what the difference was. Not skill, not preparation, but simply the decision made somewhere in the dark of February that this mountain was his and he was staying. He told her about Helena, not the death, that he'd told her already, in pieces, during Caleb's illness, but the living. How they'd met at a trading post when he was 28, and she was 19, and she'd argued with him about the price of salt, with such confident authority that he'd been so surprised he'd agreed to the price before he'd known what happened. How she'd come up to the mountain with him the following spring and looked around at what he'd built and said, without a trace of irony, that it would do. How she'd made the cabin into a home by the sheer force of her commitment to it, by treating every hard day as a solvable problem rather than an indictment. Eliza listened to all of it without filling the pauses. She understood, without him saying so, that he was giving her something by telling it. Not a comparison, not a template, but a context. A way of understanding what the mountain had asked of him and what it had taken. "She would have argued with you too," he said one evening, after a long story about Helena's approach to winter food stores that had involved a detailed disagreement conducted over 3 days. About the leg. Eliza considered that. Did she win? Usually. A pause. Not always. Did you listen more when she didn't push? He was quiet for a moment. Probably. Then I learned something useful, she said. He almost smiled. She saw it. The very beginning of it. The shift at the corner of his mouth before it was pulled back under. And she went back to her work and let it be. March arrived like a negotiation. One cold day followed by one marginally less cold day, the mountain not conceding spring so much as beginning to consider it. The snow was still deep, but the quality of light had changed, longer now, and with an actual warmth in the afternoon hours that the January light had never had. Icicles formed on the south edge of the porch roof and dripped steadily on clear days. The creek, which had been locked since November, began to speak again under its ice, a low mutter that grew daily. Rowan was back on his trap lines in the 3rd week of February, technically 2 days earlier than Eliza had approved, but close enough that she decided not to fight it. The leg held. The ribs gave him trouble on the steep sections. She could tell from how he moved when he came in, the way he favored his left arm slightly. But he never mentioned it, and she only monitored it rather than commented, respecting the boundary between what was her domain and what was his. Caleb was entirely himself again by the beginning of March, running through the cabin with the fully restored energy of a 7-year-old who has been ill and recovered and is now making up for lost time at a rate that was occasionally exhausting for everyone else in the building. He had developed a new habit of sitting with Eliza in the evenings and asking her questions, not about medicine or practical things, but about the wider world, the world below the mountain that he'd seen only as an infant, that existed for him mostly as a collection of second-hand descriptions. "What's the settlement like?" he asked one evening while she was darning a sock and he was supposed to be going to sleep. "Like most settlements," she said. "Smaller than you'd hope and louder than you'd expect." "Are there lots of people?" "Enough. Maybe 200, give or take." He considered that. "Are they nice?" She thought about it honestly. "Some of them." "Are there children?" "Plenty of children." I was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "Will we go sometime? Pa said maybe in spring we'd go for trade." "That's your father's decision. Would you come?" She looked at him. His face was open and entirely certain of her, the way faces are when they haven't yet learned that certainty about people is something you earn rather than assume. It occurred to her that at some point over these months, without ceremony or announcement, she had become the fixed point of his world, the person you asked questions to, the person you wanted alongside. "If I'm invited," she said. He looked at her like the possibility of her not being invited was so remote it hadn't occurred to him to consider it. "You'll be invited," he said, with the absolute confidence of 7. She went back to the darning and didn't say anything more, but something settled in her chest as she worked, warm and complicated. The conversation about the settlement happened between her and Rowan in early April, when the snow had dropped enough that the idea of the journey was at least theoretical. He brought it up himself, which surprised her. He'd been checking his gear one evening, inventorying what needed resupply, and he looked up from the list he'd been making in his slow, deliberate handwriting and said, "I'll need to go down in a few weeks, trade the winter furs, stock back up on what we've run through." "All right," she said. "I thought—" He stopped, looked back at the list. "The children haven't been down since last fall. Might be good for them." "It would be good for them," she agreed. Another pause. She waited. "You'd come," he said. Not quite a question, not quite a statement, somewhere between them. "If that's what you want," she said carefully. He looked up at her then, directly, with the gray eyes that she could read much better now than she'd been able to in November. What she saw in them was something she recognized because she'd felt a version of it herself, the particular discomfort of wanting something that you don't have established language for yet. "It's what I want," he said, simple and plain. He looked back at his list. She kept her face neutral and felt something turn over quietly in her chest. They went down to Caldwell Crossing on a Thursday in mid-April, all 5 of them. Eliza rode her own horse, the same steady mare from the first ride up, who had become, over winter, an animal she had real affection for, wearing the heavy fur coat she'd been given the materials for after Rowan brought in a particularly good trapping season and told her without preamble to make herself something warmer. She'd made it herself, working at it over 3 weeks of evenings, and it fit the way things fit when you've made them for your own body. She rode beside Rowan. The children spread out between them and behind them, Caleb on a small pony that he managed with the solemn pride of a boy who has been trusted with something real. She had not thought much about returning to the settlement. She'd been focused on the mountain, on the daily and the immediate, and Caldwell Crossing had existed at the edge of her awareness, like a place from a previous version of her life. Now, as they came down out of the timber and the valley opened up below them, she felt the strangeness of it. Not the emotional devastation she might have expected, not grief exactly, but a clean and clarifying sense of distance. The settlement looked smaller than it had. Or maybe she was just larger. She heard it before she fully registered what she was hearing. The quality of silence that moves through a public space when something unexpected arrives. They rode into the main street of Caldwell Crossing in the mid-morning, and she watched heads turn, watched the turning become stillness, watched people stop what they were doing and look. She had expected to feel the old thing, the settlement girl's instinct to make herself smaller, to fold herself down into something less conspicuous. She was surprised to find she didn't feel it at all. She sat straight in the saddle and looked back at whoever looked at her, not with aggression, just with the calm of a person who has been through a harder winter than anyone watching and is neither proud of it nor apologizing for it. At the trading post, the man behind the counter, A heavy-set man named Dern, who had known Rowan for years, looked at Eliza for a long moment before looking at Rowan. "This the Hale girl?" he said. He didn't mean it unkindly exactly. He was just a man who said what he was thinking without particularly editing it. "This is Eliza," Rowan said. His voice carried no inflection, but it carried weight. The kind of weight that specified, without elaboration, that Hale girl was not the adequate term and would not be used again. Dern looked between them for a moment. "Right," he said, and began pulling out the ledger. She explored the settlement while Rowan conducted his trading, taking the children with her. Caleb wanted to see everything and narrated the experience in a continuous stream of observations. Jesse looked at things with the focused attention he brought to everything, storing information. Nora walked beside Eliza with the particular composure of a girl who had grown up on a mountain and was not especially impressed by a settlement, which Eliza found quietly satisfying. She went to the general store. She needed thread, and she needed salt, and she had a short list of medicinal supplies she'd run low on over the winter. The woman behind the counter was someone Eliza recognized, Margaret Holt, who had lived 3 streets over from her father's house, and had been the kind of neighbor who noticed things and remembered them. Margaret Holt looked at Eliza with an expression that went through several stages in quick succession: surprise, assessment, and then something that might have been revision, the visible experience of updating a prior belief. "Eliza Hale," she said. "Mrs. Holt. You look—" She stopped. Started again. "You look well." "I am," Eliza said. She put her list on the counter. "I need these things, please." While Margaret gathered the supplies, she asked the question that was clearly the real question. Is Creed? She seemed to be working out how to phrase it. "Are you all right up there?" Eliza looked at her steadily. She thought about how to answer this with the precision it deserved. "I'm better than all right," she said. "The children are healthy. The stores came through the winter. We're building out the east side of the cabin this spring." She met Margaret's eyes. "It's home." Margaret Holt looked at her for another moment, and something moved through the woman's face that was difficult to read but felt like a genuine reckoning. The adjustment of a story she'd been telling herself about how this had gone. "I'm glad," she said, and meant it more than Eliza expected. She found her father in the afternoon. She'd known she would have to. He was sitting outside the saloon in the thin April sun, looking older than 5 months ought to have made him, and he saw her coming from half a block away and sat up straighter in the way of a man who isn't sure what to do with his hands. She stopped in front of him, looked at him. He looked back at her. His face worked through several things. Guilt was in there. So was something more complicated. The beginning of an explanation he'd been rehearsing, probably, and the recognition that it wouldn't hold up. "Eliza," he said. "Papa." A long silence. A dog went past on the other side of the street. Someone was hammering somewhere. "Are you—" he started. "I'm all right," she said. "I'm going to be all right." She wasn't going to tell him it was fine. It wasn't fine. What he'd done was not a thing that could be made fine by outcome, because the outcome could have gone very differently, and the decision had been the same either way. She understood, in the specific way you understand things after you've had time and distance, that her father was a man who had been failing at his life for a long time and had made a desperate choice the way desperate men do, without fully reckoning with what it would cost someone else. He wasn't monstrous. He was small and sorry, and those were their own kind of difficult. "I'm not coming back," she said. "You should know that. I'm not coming back to this house." He nodded. He looked at his hands. "Ada and Molly," she said. "I'm going to write to them. I want them to come up to the mountain in summer, if Rowan agrees, which I think he will." She paused. "You'll let them come?" It wasn't a question. "Yes," he said, quietly. She looked at him for another moment. At the man he was, with the gap between who he might have been and who he'd become sitting visible in his face like something he'd long stopped trying to hide. "Take care of yourself," she said. "Actually try." She walked away. She didn't look back. Not because she felt nothing. She felt a complicated, heavy something, the kind of feeling that doesn't resolve into a single emotion but sits in the chest as a whole weather system. But because looking back served neither of them. What was behind her was behind her. It had made her who she was, and that was the whole of its utility. Rowan was waiting near the horses when she found him, the trading done, the pack mule loaded. He read something in her face when she approached. He always read something in her face. And he didn't ask about it directly. Ready? He said. Yes, she said. He helped her up onto her horse, which he did not usually do. It wasn't necessary. She could mount on her own and always had. It was just a thing he did, one hand briefly at her elbow as she swung up and then released. She settled into the saddle and looked down at him for a moment, at the gray eyes looking back at her with something in them that they'd been working up to for months now. Rowan, she said. I know, he said. Just that. She almost laughed. You don't know what I was going to say. Probably not, he said. But whatever it is, I know. She looked at him for a long moment. At the man the mountain had made, and the man the mountain hadn't managed to finish making alone, and the distance between those two things that she had somehow become part of without planning it. All right, she said. Let's go home. They rode back up through the timber as the afternoon light went gold and long across the snowfields, the five of them strung out along the trail in their usual loose formation, Caleb up close behind Rowan, chattering about everything he'd seen, Jesse quiet behind him, Nora riding level with Eliza. The mountain received them back into itself the way the mountain received things it had decided to keep. Without ceremony, without commentary, just the closing of the trees around them and the rising of the elevation and the gradual fading of the valley, sounds until there was nothing but the horses breathing and the wind in the high pines. Nora pulled her horse alongside Eliza's. They rode that way for a while without talking. Then Nora said, You're going to stay. Not a question, a statement. Yes, Eliza said. Nora nodded slowly. She was looking ahead, at the trail, at the mountain rising into the blue above them. Good, she said. They rode the rest of the way in the comfortable silence of people who have said the important thing and don't need to elaborate on it. The cabin came through the trees in the late afternoon, the chimney cold because no one was there to feed it, the windows dark, the woodpile on the side still stacked with the careful solidity that Eliza had made her own project through the winter months. She looked at it, this structure on the side of a mountain, this thing built from labor and grief and stubbornness, and felt the specific quality of feeling that she didn't have a single word for, the feeling that means, this is mine and I belong to it, and it belongs to me. She dismounted and tied the horse and went inside to start the fire. That was the work. That was always the work. Not the dramatic moments, not the avalanche or the sick child or the man thrown across a cabin floor, but the daily, unglamorous, continuous work of keeping a fire going and a family fed, and a life built in a place that asked everything of you in return for something that couldn't be measured in the terms the valley used for measuring things. She got the fire going. The children came in behind her, Caleb immediately exploring the cabin as though he'd been gone a year rather than a day. Jesse moving through his evening routine with the quiet competence that had become one of the most reliable sounds in her life. Nora took her place at the kitchen counter without being asked, taking up the portion of supper preparation that was hers without discussion. Rowan came in last, having seen to the horses. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the room, the fire, the activity, the noise of Caleb's narration resuming where it had left off during the ride, the smell of food starting, the amber light of a cabin coming back to life. He looked at all of it with an expression she could read now, clearly, without effort. He was looking at it the way a man looks at something he was afraid he would lose and hasn't. He looked at her. She looked back. Across the room, across the noise and the movement and the ordinary life of it, the thing between them sat plain and named in the air for exactly as long as it needed to before he crossed the room and she turned back to the stove. Hungry? She said. Starving, he said, and sat down at the table. This was not the end of the difficult things. She knew that. The mountain didn't make promises, and neither did life on it. There would be more bad winters and more illness, and more of the thousand small and large emergencies that this country generated without apology. Rowan would make decisions she disagreed with. She would make decisions that frustrated him. Nora would go through whatever the next years of her life required, and it would be hard in ways none of them could predict. Jesse would grow up quiet and capable and private, and Caleb would grow up loud and curious and attached to everything, and they would all become people that the circumstances of this particular winter had helped shape without any of them choosing it. That was the thing about hard places and hard times. They didn't build the people you planned to be. They built the people you actually were, the ones that had been in there all along waiting for sufficient pressure to come fully into form. She had been sold for $40. She had been traded like a problem to be solved, handed to a stranger with a bad reputation and a mountain full of grief, and everyone who had known about it had shaken their head and thought, that girl won't make it through the winter. She had made it through the winter. She had made it through Harlan Pike, and a sick child, and an avalanche, and the particular daily endurance of building trust with people who had every reason not to give it. She had made it through herself, through the fear, through the moments where the easier thing would have been to go smaller, to want less, to ask less of the life she'd been handed. She hadn't gone smaller. She didn't think she could have, even if she'd tried. That was the thing the mountain had shown her that she hadn't known before she came up it, that you don't discover what you're made of in comfortable circumstances. You discover it in the places that demand everything and give you nothing for free. You discover it in the cold, in the work, in the night you sit beside a sick child and refuse to stop trying, in the moment you look at a man pinned under a fallen tree, and your body finds something beyond its own limits because there is simply no alternative. She had been a girl sold for $40. She had become the woman who kept the fire burning on the highest ridge. Outside, the mountain held its ground in the last of the evening light, permanent and indifferent and vast, as it had been before any of them arrived and would be long after all of them were gone. But inside the cabin on its flank, the fire burned and the food cooked and the children made the sounds of children at the end of a long day. And Rowan Creed sat at the head of the table he'd built with his own hands and looked at the life inside his walls with something in his gray eyes that he hadn't had when winter started. And Eliza stood at the stove in her fur coat, in her home, on her mountain, and she was warm all the way through.